some things is just a fact. Some things change based on your circumstances. Like, not everything it always just stays the same, right? Things change, and many times it is because circumstances change. The particulars of a situation change. And so whatever this concept is we're thinking of, we come up with examples. These things change. When you're low on cash, what has to change? Your budget, right? Your spending habits have to change, you know. When you're low on food, your eating habits have to change, that sort of thing. Your level of hunger differs, you know, your satisfaction level differs based on how much food you've had. Speaking of food, when you eat well and exercise, the size and shape of your body changes. Likewise, if you don't eat well and exercise, the size of your body changes, right? Some things change based on circumstances. Now, some things, though, they don't change. They're constants. If you take on debt to purchase a car, you owe your master the same amount of money, whether that car is running like a top or sitting in a ditch somewhere on its top, right? Doesn't change. I used to work in the banking industry and had to explain that to people, and they struggled to understand it seems like. Let's go back to the eating well and exercising thing. You give yourself the best chance to live a longer life, but guess what? You're not going to escape what everyone is going to face, and that is death in this life. So that's not going to change. Having more or less money does not affect your ability to be happy. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some people who get more happy when they get more money, but having more or less money does not actually affect your ability to be happy. You can be happy. You have the ability to be happy and joyful, whether you have a lot or a little. Some things don't change based on or as a direct result of your circumstances. This morning, I want to talk about what the Bible teaches about contentment. And contentment is one of these things that does not, or so it should not, change based on your circumstances. Now, when we use the word content, I want to make sure we know what we're talking about when we say contentment. I don't want you to think of contentment as settling for less. Some people think you need to be talked into being content. I need to talk you into being content with what you have because you probably ain't getting any more. You know, most people don't want to be content if that's the definition they have, because they're like, I'd rather just have more and be happy with that, you know, like if I have options. But some people think of contentment as just settling for less. But I don't want you to think of it like that. I want you to think of it like this. Contentment, it's the state of satisfaction that we can live in if and when these things are true. When we have faith in God to provide, when we trust in what He chooses to provide, and when we're thankful for all that He provides. Okay, so soak that in for a second, because I want you to have that in mind as we talk about contentment throughout the message, so that I don't have to say it 12 times, okay? It's the state of satisfaction that we can live in if we have faith in God to provide, when we trust in what He chooses to provide to us, and when we're thankful or grateful and we express that gratitude to Him, thankful for all that He provides. Okay, so think of that this morning as we talk about contentment. Later this week, we're going to kick off what we typically call the holiday season. Rob, in true Rob fashion, has really already kicked off the holiday season for us back there with his Temu shirt. But what's the holiday season? Man, Thanksgiving Thursday, right? Christmas will be right around the corner before you know it. New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. Don't forget Black Friday and Cyber Monday, right? These are all the holiday season, the most wonderful time of the year, we call it, right? But seriously, the holidays are a real proving ground for our contentment. We're going to find out, you know, whether a person is content or not through the holidays, okay? If we're truly content, we're going to stand out radically, in a good way, from the rest of the holiday chaos. If we have contentment, when all this stuff comes bearing down on us, man, you're going to stand out in a good way, like I said, if you're content. But if, like many people, we're discontent, the holidays are going to expose that as well, okay? So today, I want to bring you a message called With Little or Much. With little or much. And we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. We'll read through that in just a moment. In this passage, Paul is going to sincerely thank the Christians in Philippi for a generous gift that they have given him. He's going to give them, he's going to express his gratitude for this gift to them. But then he's going to go on in the next couple of verses to speak about contentment and also where that contentment comes from, okay? So really important stuff, and you're going to find that he uses this phrase with little or much. He's content, can be content, and we all can be, spoiler alert, with little or with much. And there's three really powerful lessons, I think, in this passage that we can and should really need to learn from about contentment that Paul talks about here. So follow along with me as we jump into the text, Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Paul writes to the Christians in Philippi, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need." Then it says in verse 13, what a lot of us have heard before, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Now, let's jump right into the lessons this morning. The first lesson that we see, the first contentment lesson that's brought to our attention that shows up here is this: contentment transcends physical circumstances. All right? Right off the bat, and this is a short, quick lesson, we just need to make sure we notice this. We need to understand this, that contentment transcends physical circumstances. Now, this is brought to our attention in verse 11 by Paul. Paul writes there in verse 11, he says, "Not that I speak from want," he says, "for I have learned to be content," so we're talking about being content, "in whatever circumstances I am." Did you catch it? Okay? It's complicated, I know, it's complex. When can Paul be content? When can't Paul be content? What circumstances are required for Paul to be content? He can be content in whatever circumstances, right? Paul says whatever circumstances he's in, right? The world can throw at us whatever they want. It's a fact. This is the way it's supposed to be. We can have little, we can have much. We can have popularity, or we can be looked down upon by the world. We can be in a good place or a bad place by the world's standards when it comes to how they see us as a success or a failure, that kind of stuff. And we can still be content. This contentment that we want to gain, it's something that does not depend, like we said, on physical circumstances. It's something we can and need to learn about and choose to be. And we're going to talk more about how we do that in just a minute. But understand, first of all, it is something that we need to learn about and choose to be. Okay? When you choose to be something, do circumstances dictate whether you can or cannot be? No, when you're choosing to make a change in who you are, that's a you thing. We're going to find out there's someone else involved in that with the contentment we're talking about. But that's a decision that you need to make. But you need to learn about contentment, and then you need to choose to be content. Contentment comes from an inner strength. It's not dependent on money and possessions and even food and other resources that we might call necessities of life. And so it's that inner strength that makes contentment something that transcends physical circumstances, okay? The world thinks that it's the other way around, right? The world will tell you that circumstances and material wealth, those define your range or your limits for contentment. Like, you can't be content with this. Like, you need to be discontent. You need to strive for more. You need to get more, gain more, that sort of thing. They think the mile markers or the goal lines for contentment are reached by being successful according to their standards, right? Success is a moving target in the world today, right? But you can't argue against the fact that there are people with plenty of all this stuff that makes a person successful, so they say, that are not content, right? You cannot argue with the fact that there are people with lots of money, lots of material possessions, you name it, that are very unhappy, not content, not secure in themselves and with what they have and what they've become in life. In fact, let's go on even beyond physical possessions and things. There are all kinds of unsatisfied, discontented people who have influence, who have power, who are seen as leader types, people at the top of the food chain, so to speak. That kind of stuff doesn't satisfy. The material possessions, the influence and power, things like that, But while it is an inner strength that we're saying that makes this contentment transcend physical circumstances, it doesn't come from inside of us. Like, it's not our own power that does this. The strength we need to be content in all circumstances, with little or much, it's not sourced from our own abilities. We're not born with this, okay? The Stoics tried this. They tried to empty themselves. They tried to achieve this inner strength by emptying themselves of all desires, right? All kinds of wants, all kinds of emotion. They tried to get rid of all feelings. They tried this. And of course, no living human being can actually do that. It's impossible to have no desires, no emotion, no feelings of any kind, good or bad. So this inner strength, it can't be accomplished like the Stoics tried to do. It has to be done another way. And we're going to talk about that. That leads us into our second lesson, and it's this. Contentment isn't coincidence, okay? We're going to say it that way for now. Contentment isn't coincidence. It's not something that just happens, right? You don't sit around and wait long enough and, people tell me all the time that my crazy dogs are going to calm down when they get a certain age. And I run into other people that they're like, yeah, probably not, It's not something you just wait around long enough for, Contentment isn't that way either. Contentment isn't something that, when you hit 50, you'll learn to be content. When you retire, you'll learn to be content. It doesn't work like that. It's not a coincidence. You don't stumble into it. It's not some kind of accident. In fact, Paul makes it pretty clear in the text that we read that contentment requires us to be intentional about it. Remember I said earlier, something we need to learn about and then become? All right, listen to how Paul says contentment has come about in his life. Verses 11 and 12 here of our text. He says, not that I speak from want. This is the verse we read a second ago, but I want you to focus on something a little bit different here now. He says, for I have learned. Hear that? I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. Verse 12, he says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. Paul says in verse 11, I have learned. He says at the beginning of verse 12 that he knows something about contentment, right? Which means there's a certain knowledge involved with this, something you need to know. And at the end of verse 12, he says he has learned the secret of being able to do these things and be content, right? These verses show us that the knowledge Paul possesses. The verses show us that the knowledge Paul possesses that allows him to be content is something that he has learned. Okay, the knowledge that he possesses, he's learned this. He wasn't born with it, that sort of thing, right? Contentment has to be gained this way. We have to learn about contentment. It's not coincidence. The definition of coincidence, in case you're not fully understanding, it's a remarkable concurrence, it says, of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. Something that just happens with no real explanation as to how it happened, but boy, it's a good thing it did, right? A happy little accident, that sort of thing. Contentment isn't something that you experience for no apparent reason at just the right time when you need it. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't fall into your lap. It's learned. And in a certain way, we might even say that it's earned. Now, I don't mean that in one way, we wouldn't say it's earned, but in another way that we use the term earned, it might be. Sometimes we use the term earned not to say that it's something that was merited, but it's something that we would expect to happen because of something someone did. I'll explain. Somebody pokes a bear. Do they deserve to die a horrible death? No, not necessarily. Now, some of you have other opinions maybe than I do, but not necessarily. But will we say that a bear mauling is to be expected? And in a sense, we might say, boy, they earned that, right? That they got what they had coming to them, that sort of thing. Or think about this. What about the person, let's be a little more serious here, what about the person who has a near-death experience because of their own, we'll just say it, their own stupidity, messing around with drugs and alcohol or you name it, and then they end up making a reasonable or even a good living by going around the country and speaking to people who are right on the verge of maybe making those kind of decisions in their own life and helping them to avoid the mistakes they've made. Now, do they deserve to be paid for their stupidity in the past? Again, not necessarily. However, would we maybe say that they have, in a sense, earned the right to stand on those platforms and to speak to those people? Yeah, we would use the term that way. compared to those who never experienced what they did, we would say they earned something valuable through those difficult experiences. Well, Paul learned and earned the contentment that he had. The experiences that he faced contributed to his ability to be content, right? Contentment is not just a book learning kind of thing. You need to learn about it, but not just through reading and studying. You need to do that and understand what contentment is and see how it played out in the Bible, people who were content. But you also have to earn it in the sense that there's some experiences you need to go through. In a certain way, you need to go through those things. Look at the situations Paul brings up as examples for him. In verse 12, I do not have it on the... Oh, yeah, there it is. Sorry, it's already on the screen. He says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and of going hungry, of both having abundance and suffering need. So he mentions like 3 different examples here, 3 different things that he's faced, 3 different comparisons of living one way and living through and dealing with another way, right? When Paul talks about humble means and prosperity, humble means is talking about obviously not having a whole lot. There's a lot of us in this room that would say, we grew up with humble means. We might say it a different way, but we know what it means. Prosperity is talking about having plenty, possibly even being wealthy, but not necessarily. It may just be, like I said, having plenty, having what you need, having enough. Now, it's pretty clear there were times when Paul would have obviously been a man of humble means. Paul traveled a lot. These were not business trips. He was not being reimbursed for mileage or anything else like that. That wasn't the situation for Paul. Paul spent time in prison preaching because he was preaching Christ, right? And the government wasn't sending him checks while he was in these facilities, while he was being housed in the jails, right? In 2 Corinthians 11:9, Paul specifically says he was in need. He says he was in need. Now, on the other hand, there were times when Paul would have been, we would say, prosperous, living in prosperity. Of course, before Paul became a Christian, he probably lived in what most would call prosperity. There in Philippians chapter 3, just right before what we're reading now, Paul said something that a lot of us are familiar with. He goes through this list of reasons why he puts confidence, or he was able to put confidence in the flesh before, meaning his pedigree, meaning worldly success, meaning how men looked at him. He's like, if anybody has reason to put confidence in the flesh, I far more than anybody else, right? And I'm sure a lot of that through his status and position as a Pharisee in the old Jewish system, I'm sure he was being well taken care of in those roles that he filled at the time. That was before he was a Christian. But even as a Christian, there were times where he earned money for himself. There were times when churches gave him generous gifts. There were times when Christians invited him into their homes and would have provided for his needs, right? Paul says he has learned how to be content in poverty and prosperity. He's been through them both, and he's been content in them both. Paul also talks about being filled and going hungry. Now, Paul uses interesting language here. When he's talking about being filled and being hungry, it's not something you necessarily can hear in the English translation, but in the Greek it bears out that this word that Paul used is a phrase, the phrase that's translated as being filled. It's a word that was often used of animals who had plenty of fodder, plenty of grass to graze on, okay? So it's this idea of an animal that's being put out to a field to fatten up. Right? There's plenty, because that's the goal, is that they eat plenty, right? Now, hungry, the term he uses there, it has this idea, it paints this picture of animals who have no grass at all. They have nothing to live off of. In 2 Corinthians 11:27, Paul says, I have been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Now, we can read that just on the page and think like, oh, wow, sounds like bad stuff. Now what do we have to say about that, preacher? But I mean, listen to this. And imagine you or someone you know went through this, and it's not a made-up story. It's the truth. He says, I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and he says, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Now, this one is tough, I think, for us, because food is one of life's basic necessities. Everybody needs food. We need food to live, right? But Paul has learned to be content with plenty of food, or even when he has to go for a time without enough or without any, right? One of life's basic necessities. Then Paul talks about having abundance versus suffering need. Paul's talking about finances here, okay? Having abundance is pretty similar to the prosperity that he mentioned before, but suffering need here literally means that there were times when Paul had, quote, fallen behind, right? And we're talking about finances, so there are times when he has in some form or fashion fallen behind on a current financial need. He needed money for something and it wasn't there. The phrase can mean to come short. Maybe it was a debt that Paul owed. Maybe it was just something that Paul desperately needed at the moment but didn't have the means to acquire. Regardless, Paul says here that he's experienced the pressure of what we might call being behind in our finances. Now, these are times that tempt a lot of us to become discontent. I mean, when you have enough money to buy many of the things you need and to cover your bills, most of us still have a tendency to want more. But when you don't even have enough to cover what you currently owe or what you currently need, that's an easy time for people to struggle with being discontent. That's an easy time for discontentment to dominate your mind, for that need, that current need to dominate your mind. But Paul says he's learned to be content in both situations, both sets of circumstances. And as followers of Christ, we too should be learning to be content in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. But where does this inner strength come from? That's what we really need to get down to, right? We know that it transcends circumstances, physical circumstances. We know it's something that we can and must learn, but where does it come from? What is this mystery or this secret that Paul says he knows, he's figured out, he's learned, right? Well, it's important to notice that Paul says he's learned the secret. Right? Not he's learned a secret that helps. It's not a life hack. He says he's learned the secret. There's one way to achieve this inner strength required to actually be content. So our third and final lesson, it's the mystery revealed. Contentment is accomplished through Christ. Contentment is accomplished through Christ. You knew it was coming. This is not shocking to anyone in the room. You knew this was the answer, but there it is. Paul said it in verse 13. He said, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Now, having learned that Paul's talking about the ability to be content in times of crisis or in times of calmness, in times of scarcity or surplus, feast or famine, you name it, we can see what he's actually saying now in verse 13. Because the world uses verse 13 in one way, Paul uses it in a totally different way, right? Contrary to the bumper sticker theology, as we might call it, I can do all things through Christ does not have anything to do with you being able to fulfill all of your wildest dreams or your heart's desires or anything like that. Christ does not strengthen us to get a really good deal on a new car. He doesn't have any concern over whether your favorite college football team wins the game or not. It doesn't have anything to do with that, or even if you're playing in the game. Christ is not strengthening you to win a ball game. In fact, Paul's not talking at all about being able to accomplish tasks. That's not what he's talking about. In verse 13, Paul's doing a couple of things. He's summarizing his ability to bear up, to hold up under any circumstances. Again, not to check something off of a bucket list, not to be able to do something that you've always wanted to do, and I believe that through Christ I can do it. No, he's talking about being able to bear up, handling circumstances that are difficult or that some might consider easy, but in both cases, you have to be careful to be content in both. So he's talking about that, summarizing his ability to bear up under circumstances, and he's sharing where that ability comes from, right? In context, Paul's saying he can handle poverty or prosperity, being hungry, being filled, having abundance or suffering needs, because his inner strength is Christ himself. Listen to 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. We read this, I think, last week, at least verse 9. Paul writes there, and he, that's Jesus, has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, this is Paul speaking now, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. The power of Christ dwelling in me. Verse 10, therefore I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Here is a passage of Scripture where Paul again speaks of the power of Christ dwelling and working in him. And notice that Paul, he's not out there winning any trophies. He's not crossing things, like I said, off the list of things he always wants to do, always wanted to do. He's not talking about finding a new hobby that Christ is helping him to enjoy and do well. It's not anything like that. This wasn't an example of the world's version of Philippians 4:13. Instead, Paul says that during times of weaknesses, during times of being insulted, being persecuted, being mistreated, being distressed, all these different times, difficult times, it was the power of Christ that was sustaining him, not his own power. In fact, he had come to a point where he was satisfied with his own weaknesses because the power of Christ was seen and shown and demonstrated, manifested in his life through those things. Now, how can you and I have this? How can you and I have this contentment that Paul's talking about, that we need to have as Christians? It takes a relationship. Now that can sound cliche, but I want to help you understand what I'm talking about. It takes a relationship with Christ to be content in any and all circumstances, not knowledge alone, not emotion alone, not desire alone. You have to actually know Jesus. You have to know who he is, what he's done, what he's doing, what he's going to do, and why. You have to have knowledge of him. You need to have experience with Jesus. Paul did. And he demonstrates for us that he had moments where he experienced this circumstance. He went through this and he went through that. And he was able to learn to be content in all of those circumstances. We talked about all that Paul went through for and with Christ. And that's the important thing. You don't just go through hard times and good times. You go through those things with a special emphasis of your mind on Christ, right? You need to face some times of abundance, relying on Christ, not your own ability to earn income, not your own ability to make a buck, not your own ability to turn a profit, right? Not your own perceived power at the time, right? You need to go through times of abundance relying on Christ. Likewise, you need to face some times of suffering need, some times of want, some times of desperation, again, focused on, relying on Christ, not your own abilities or the promises of other men's abilities, right? You need to go through these things with Christ, relying on him, with a focus on Christ and his will. When we rely on Christ in good times and bad times, when we actually recognize and acknowledge him during these circumstances, when we pray and we remember his word and his power and do his will and seek to bring honor and glory to him somehow through everything and anything we might be going through, well, Christ strengthens us in that. But not if that focus isn't there. That focus has to be there. That desire to experience Christ and his glory in those moments, that's how you learn it. That's how you get it. That's how you grab a hold of it. I don't want to make it sound mystical and magical because it's not. It is very practical. But there's a way that you can try and never get it. So you have to do it like this. It takes knowledge, it takes experience, and it takes a focus on Christ, relying on him through all of it, and he'll strengthen you in those things. And get this, you probably already caught it, but let me make sure I don't miss pointing this out to you. This is not a limited time thing. It's not once or twice that he'll do this. It's not like, well, you get 3 strikes, or you get 5 opportunities a week, for Christ to strengthen you. It's not in certain circumstances or anything like that. Christ strengthens us continually. The verb strengthens in Philippians 4:13 is in the present tense, indicating continuous action, that he continually strengthens us. Now, how does acknowledging Christ in all circumstances continually strengthen us? Well, just think about it. Ultimately, it's through the hope that we have in him. There's always something better to look forward to when you're in Christ. The best is yet to come, right? Ultimately, it's through that hope that we have in him, knowing that our Creator loves us, knowing that he died for us, knowing that he rose from the grave, knowing that he wants us to live with him forever, knowing that he fights for us today, not later on. Today he's doing that for us, knowing that he protects us, knowing that he provides for us, knowing that everything here on earth is temporary, knowing that treasures that we lay up in heaven when we focus on things above, not things below, those things last forever. Those things are more valuable than anything earthly that we could build or grab a hold of or gain or try to hold on to. And knowing that heaven is our home and that life on this earth is, we could call it, as cheesy as it might sound, a short-term mission trip. We got work to do, but in the long term, it's short. It's a short-term mission trip. Guys, remember, Contentment, like we said before, it's a state of satisfaction that we can live in if we have faith in God to provide. When we have trust in what He chooses to provide, and when we're thankful for all that He provides. If you are in Christ, biblically in Christ, and Christ is in you today, you have access, full access to that inner strength we're talking about that it takes to be content with little or with much.